Good evening, listeners, brave navigators of the enigmatic and the concealed. Have you ever felt the pull of the unanswered, the allure of the mysteries that shroud our existence? For more than a decade, a unique comic publisher has dared to dive into these mysteries, unafraid of the secrets they might uncover. This audacious entity is Paranoid American. Welcome to the mystifying universe of the Paranoid American podcast.
Launched in the year 2012, Paranoid American has been on a mission to decipher the encrypted secrets of our world. From the unnerving enigma of MK Ultra mind control to the clandestine assemblies of secret societies. From the awe-inspiring frontiers of forbidden technology to the arcane patterns of occult symbols in our very own pop culture. They have committed to unveiling the concealed realities that lie just beneath the surface. Join us as we navigate these intricate landscapes, decoding the hidden scripts of our society and challenging the accepted perceptions of reality.
Folks, I've got a big problem on my hands. There's a company called Paranoid American making all these funny memes and comics. Now, I'm a fair guy. I believe in free speech as long as it doesn't cross the line. And if these AI-generated memes dare to make fun of me, they're crossing the line.
This is your expedition into the realm of the extraordinary, the secret, the shrouded. Come with us as we sift through the world's grand mysteries, question the standardized narratives, and brave the cryptic labyrinth of the concealed truth. So strap yourselves in, broaden your horizons, and steel yourselves for a voyage into the enigmatic heart of the Paranoid American podcast, where each story, every image, every revelation brings us one step closer to the elusive truth.
Welcome back. Another episode. Right to it. Here's Emily Moyer, one of the coolest people to talk to about a whole range of a million different topics. And we're only going to cover maybe like 999,000 of them today, but we're not going to get to all a million. So anyways, Emily has agreed to do just like a 4-day power session. We are not going to stop talking for 4 days straight until we cover every single issue that there is to talk about. So strap in, get some water, get some snacks. Let's start. And we actually have some live viewers from Guinness World Records, I believe, that are live into the stream. Wave to the Guinness Book people. And we're going for a record. So no, I'm just kidding. We'll keep it to a normal length. But Emily, I just want to say again, welcome to Paranoid American Podcast. Here, we'll take you out of the frame. I just like doing that at the beginning.
That was fun. I love it.
So tell people who you are, what you're about, where they can find your stuff, and how much it joins the cost of cult.
Well, first of all, that was I loved your whole 2-minute intro and the way you brought me in, and the idea of you and I talking for 4 days straight. Sounds like for viewers that would be terrifying, but I don't doubt that you and I could probably power through that.
We'd need breaks. We'd need like power naps, but I think that's not even something that would faze me.
Right. And I wonder how far, I wonder if we were to take on that challenge, how far into getting to the bottom of anything we would come, or would we just generate 10 million new rabbit holes that need exploring? Right. And
that one. It would be that one.
But it sounds fun, and it sounds like, if we, find ourselves in some sort of strange scenario where you and I are either locked in the same bunker together or in our own separate bunkers with not much else to do other than an internet connection to each other, that we can try that someday.
Let's figure out reality. We're just going to figure out this reality thing. And
totally.
As silly as that sounds on its surface, though, if you believe the conventional history of Rene Descartes, which is, I always bring him up. I'm obsessed with this dude, even though he was kind of a jerk. He tortured dogs and stuff, but he apparently was able to derive the concept of photons and light and optic nerves and everything. Now, I'm sure he was cutting people open and looking at all the stuff, and that's where he derived a lot of that too. But he, through reason alone, was able to surmise things that weren't even provable at that point. So there is a reality in which we could just talk for 4 days and actually discover truth, but there'd really be no proof. That would be the biggest burden and curse of it all, right? Even if you knew you had it, there'd be absolutely no way to prove it until you had some kind of magical technology that could then measure and say, no, you're objectively correct now.
Yes, to measure it and then replicate it over and over and over again in the exact same way. Yeah. So actually, the point, what you just brought up is, it's interesting that you brought that up, because it's kind of where I'm at with a lot of things that I'm sort of looking at. So we can return to that if you like, but so that I don't stray away from what you asked me to do. I
don't even remember what I asked. So let's just
asked me to tell people about myself, which doesn't feel, I don't know if that's even necessary. Two things. Congratulations on your podcast. I very rarely am like, oh, I hope so-and-so invites me on their podcast. But in your case, I have been hoping for an invitation. You are well liked and respected by not just myself, but by all of our colleagues. And you are like a total nerd on the things that you're into. And the only motivation I see behind all the things you do is a desire to laugh, have fun, entertain, but most of all, know. So I really appreciate that. And I'm happy to be here with you today. My venture through whatever the fuck this is has been like a long and winding one. But at this point, I find myself kind of in that same situation of like, I'm trying to like solve the puzzle. I'm looking for answers, but I'm not doing it to the exclusion of like enjoying being here and having a good time with my friends and whatnot. And I also don't think that just because something resonates for me, or I feel that it is so, that it means that we all need to come to agreement about it and that everyone must subscribe to my version of reality. I think, the point of telling compelling stories is to get people to like trust in their own observations and experiences of reality and have confidence in that and be able to learn from each other's experiences and stories and research and the way we see things and whatnot. And, so that's where I'm at with what it is. Like I was, I think when I first started podcasting, it was like, I'm going to expose MK Ultra or so, I don't know, something like that. And now it's just like we live in this ever shifting, completely flexible, morphable set of realities that we are moving through. And I'm just trying to understand something about how it works, right? Because it's interesting to me, not because I think there's anything to be done about it necessarily. So in pursuit of that, I do a variety of different podcasts on my own with guests, with other co-hosts about a number of topics. And sometimes I feel like I should narrow my scope so I can go deeper. But then I also have come to the realization that the variety of things that I'm interested in and these sort of eclectic sources that I observe and interact with have been part of what kind of give me a unique worldview and a unique perspective. And so if I were to stop doing that and just zero in on one thing, I think some of that would go away. So I probably won't do that. But basically, I'm just like having my own choose your own adventure experience and talking about it with people along the way, comparing notes with others who are doing the same. And, trying to, but I mean, at the end of the day, I'm trying to solve the puzzle. If there is one to solve, I'm not even sure of that sometimes, and have a good time doing it. And, I guess improve myself in terms of my own ability to be in coherence or in alignment and, like have what I do match what I say I think, right? And that's it. And you can find me at my website is emilycmoyer.com. It really just kind of links to other things. I'm on Patreon, patreon.com/offplanetmedia, emilymoyer.locals.com and rockfin.com/Emily Moyer. I have projects with other people as well with their own sort of pages. You can join the cult for as little as $5 or up to way more than that, depending how steeped in the ideology of this nonsense you want to become.
What flavor Kool-Aid does your cult have? Do you have Sharkberry?
Well, I'm a cocktail mixologist, so my Kool-Aid is fucking delicious, right? My Kool-Aid is more like smoky old fashioned and spicy margarita, whatever, right? So there's not really a Kool-Aid. Like I encourage disagreement right? Like it's nice when we agree, but it's totally unnecessary and sometimes more fun when we don't. And what I really like is when I love being challenged, and I love when somebody can create, like, tell me what their logic, their narrative is, right? And me be able to sort of follow what their logic train is and be like interested in it and entertained by it. Whether or not I agree with it or it opposes mine or whatever is kind of not the point. It's like to be able to make your mind flexible enough to be able to see things the way other people see them and not feel threatened by that, right? And so that's what I encourage in my community. It's in our community. A lot of other people help me, and I certainly hope that there's not a single person out there that agrees with everything I say, because that would be terrifying.
Yeah, would you be scared of your clone? Like not like a literal clone, but like if you met someone that like had all the exact same beliefs, would you like wonder what they were up to 24/7?
It bothers me, right? It's one of those. I would be suspicious. I would be paranoid for sure. Like I have had enough strange experiences of sort of meeting myself face to face or other versions of myself in different conditions and whatever. And sometimes it's disturbing, sometimes it's amusing. But like I don't want to live in a world where there's another person who thinks exactly what I think. It's just not, like, that would be super boring. Like I mean, maybe that is the whole, like maybe that is the answer. Maybe like I am the only person that exists in the entire world, and that is fucking boring. So I have entertained myself by imagining all these different characters or people to come along and challenge my views and you know, play different roles and whatnot. And that same thing would be true for everyone else, including you, that we're having to hallucinate all of this conflict and diversion and whatever the fuck this is we're living in to like entertain ourselves because we're here on a desert island bored by ourselves.
I like that reality is just one big game of why are you hitting yourself? Why are you hitting yourself? You know,
right? Yeah, like you see that, you know, in some of those scenes from Fight Club, right, where they, you know,
yeah, great reference for that. You
get the peek in that like these two people are really one and the same, and this person is flogging themselves, right? I think there's a lot of truth. I mean, there was so much truth dropped in that film. I remember the first time I saw it, I was it was one of the most like significant films in terms of affecting the way I saw the world and the way I saw myself. And I was at a particularly tumultuous point in my life, and it sort of started to explain some things to me that quite honestly, I'm still getting over.
I'm right there with you. And I won't get too much of like a personal anecdote on this one, but I distinctly remember being absolutely hammered at like 2 a.m. And I don't know when it came out. I want to say I was like 15, like probably wasn't even 16 yet. And I remember being absolutely like hammered, couldn't even open my eyes, could barely even like understand what was going on, but the movie was playing because someone had put it on like, you know, earlier in the evening. And I remember like opening my eyes up every once in a while and being like, this movie's good, like remember to watch this movie like later. And I did, and it was a huge pill. I don't know what color pill Fight Club might be, the pink pill, I don't know, but I remember it introduced me to the concept of subliminal messages in like a very practical and subversive way, like using subliminal messaging to fight back against this thing, and then using, you know, like what was it, like the fat of rich people to sell back to the rich people, and like all of these weird juxtaposed, like inverted ways of like getting back at it. But it was like, look what they're doing to you, now use those exact same tools and get back at them. And that's a really juvenile summary of it, but I like that's resonated with me to this day. Like it's influenced almost everything that I do, I think. And I still remember, not necessarily the first time I saw it, but I remember like being drunk and remembering, hey, this is like really cool. Like what's happening right here? I have no idea what's happening, but I like something registered, like go back and watch it. So that was an awesome movie.
So it's one of the, if you'd like, I'm happy to share what my experience with that movie is and why I was so affected to it, which is very different than what yours is. But what you're saying is true too. That is there. And that is like a very important and valid perspective to view it from. And I can see how that would be equally as effective or at sort of, like, it affected you in the same way that how I perceived it affected me, right?
And I didn't even know it was the same person until I had seen it like 4 or 5 times. Like, I'm very slow when it comes to that kind of stuff.
On some level, me too. Yeah. Right. So first of all, I want to say this is one of the very few occasions where I think the movie is better than the book. Fight Club. I've read the book, and I can't think of any other book movie scenario where I would say that. Right. But in this case, I do think that it's true. And partially because the filmmaker was so good and the acting was so good that it just brought so much to it. But
Maybe The Shining.
I haven't seen The Shining. So, or read the book. So I can't say, but your point is probably right. I think I like your assessment of things, even when I disagree. So your point is probably correct.
I'm a tastemaker in the conspiracy world. What can I say?
Yeah, I like it. No, I don't know what your thing is. Like, if you're a smoker or a drinker and if you're a drinker, is it of whiskey or coffee or what it is? But I imagine you just kind of like sitting back and taking in the things that you like and appreciate and thinking about, like the finer points of what this means. You're definitely a tastemaker. And I like your cartoons too, your comics.
Thank you. This is about you. Let's hear about Emily.
So anywho, okay. So I first saw this movie in 2001, and it was like I wasn't paying close attention. I wasn't like, oh, I'm going to sit down and watch this movie. I was laying on the couch at my mom's house in Ventura, and I don't know, for some reason I decided to watch this movie, right? And like I had just come through and was still in like the very strange series of things going on in my life. I had just moved back to Los Angeles from Austin, the first time that I had lived in Austin. And the first experience in Austin for me, which is where I live again now, but the first experience in Austin to me was like a really deep dip into the rave scene and to really ongoing drug use and partying, and also like finding myself like towards the center of a scene as opposed to just someone who it dallied around the edges or engaged occasionally or whatnot. Like the party scene here at that time was very happening. And I was going to parties many times per week in clubs and after parties and whatnot. And for the first time, like in my life in a social setting, there was there was a lot of attention being paid to me because I was a break dancer, and it's not that common that there's a female break dancer, like at least in the rave scene at that time, right? Like it was when I was living in Los Angeles, I occasionally went to parties, but that was kind of separate from dancing for me. Like I went a few times with friends, and then when I was here, I really liked the scene, and so I was really going all the time and like working on my dancing in that sort of scenario and whatnot, right? So like I kind of had an identity that was a little bit different than what had been my whole life in Los Angeles, but I found myself partying quite a bit, and I found myself having some really strange experiences that were not explainable to me by simply drug use, right? And especially because a lot of the really strange experiences happened away from the partying. It would happen when I was in my apartment by myself, right? Kind of things. And some of them were so strange that like I was never going to tell anybody about them, right? And then I was I started to kind of fall apart And I moved back to Los Angeles, and I thought going back to Los Angeles would renormalize life, but it didn't. I had like poked through the veil of something accidentally or intentionally. I'm not quite sure. And it was bothersome to me. And when I saw this movie, I felt like, oh, this kind of matches some of these weird experiences that I had where like I seem to have some missing time. I seem to remember having encounters with people that they claim to have no memory of, right? I have memories of being places that like it's very clear in my mind, but I can't find them in physical reality. And some of those types of things were being presented in a way there. And I remember calling my therapist a few days after I saw the movie, or maybe it was like the next week I was going to see her. And I started saying that this thing that I had been trying to explain to you for like a couple of weeks, like a couple of months since I'd been back in Los Angeles, that I couldn't quite explain in a way you could understand. Like, I think I can start to explain it because like something in this movie helped me to sort of arrange it in a different way that might make some more sense to you, right? And so I explained to her, she watched the movie, and I'd say like from that day forward, I have been uncovering things about myself and my life in a way that like now we would maybe refer to as like having had some interaction with like projects or like off the books kinds of activities that go on sort of hidden in plain sight. I did not know at that point, like it would be 5 years later that like or 4 years later that in a class when I'd gone back to school, the teacher brought up the term MK Ultra, and like it jolted me in a way that like was surprising to me, right? But at the time that I was starting to discover that like there was maybe some sides to myself that I, wasn't quite in control of or aware of, I hadn't heard of it, right? But from that moment on, I've been trying to nail down some holes and some strange things that have gone on in my life. And I can honestly say that I don't know if I would ever have talked about it to another person if like that movie didn't give me an example for someone to go look at to explain what I mean.
You could have saved lots of money if you just like went to your therapist or like, watch this movie. We're going to skip the next few sessions. This thing I've been trying to explain for weeks. Just watch the movie. You'll get it. And then it'll cost you what, like $5 for a matinee instead of hundreds of dollars in sessions.
Yeah. Right. But I mean, yes, on one level, but that struggle of trying to explain to another person what you mean or what your experience was, I think is actually part of understanding it yourself. So like the bar that I set for myself now, like in podcasting or in sharing stories, whether it's about like research I've done or theories I have or explaining my own experiences and what I think they mean, is until I can explain what I'm talking about to a person of reasonable intelligence who has like some understanding of some of the same topics that I do, what I mean or what I experienced or what I think in a way that they can understand and is meaningful to them. And by meaningful, I don't mean they have to agree or think I'm right, but they now have something to examine and look at and come back to me and give me feedback on that I can also understand. And if you can't, sort of, this is just my opinion. I'm sure other people have different ways of seeing it, but until I can explain it well to someone else, I don't understand what I mean. And so that either means that I'm wrong or that there's like, I need to think about it more. I need to integrate whatever I think the occurrence was or the process was on a deeper level before I have anything meaningful to add to the conversation about it. Now, saying things out loud and getting it wrong or bumping up against walls where you're like, yeah, that doesn't make sense or whatever, that is part of the process as well. Like, I think that we have very definite ideas of what we think reality is. And when something happens that starts to break those down, like it isn't just like we have a clean, clear, new answer. right? Like there's this whole sort of myriad of perception that opens up. And I think it's a while. I mean, you know this just from people whenever they go through anything like traumatic or anything that is like on some way really a departure from the norm for them, right? How they understand the experience evolves over time. And at a certain point, they have an idea, if they've done their work, an idea of what it was and like where to put it in their life or their story about themselves, right? And the same thing is true with dealing with this information. I feel like this information, not disinformation. It sounded for a second like I said disinformation, but my opinion has changed a lot over the years on topics, right? And part of it is not just that new evidence has come forward or whatever, but like I've like moved around the room and looked at things from different angles at a much higher level than I did when I first started talking about this stuff. And when you do that, your perspective does change, maybe not totally, right? But you see things from different angles, and then the way that you talk about it or the way that you sort of deal with what space that occupies in your mind is different. Right. But yeah, that movie was the start of the, like this is a phenomenon that actually exists, because if another person is talking about it, they must have some experience with it. Right. Whereas before I thought this was just like something all in my mind and I couldn't talk about it because it was so weird. No one would understand. So yeah, very meaningful movie for me.
Well, there's also something really magic about creative works where you can blend things that don't necessarily make sense in like a linear, rational world. It's like a comic book or a movie, just like you said, a 2-hour movie could do a better job of explaining something that you were trying to put into like normal language for weeks and probably longer than that in your own head. And this is actually something that applies to writing comics or stories or movies. It also, like I do software development. That's what I like, my really thing that I've been doing my whole life. And that's the exact same philosophy that always works for me, is that when someone wants something or you want to work on a project, if you can't explain it in simple English terms first, then your idea is either incomplete or it's wrong, or what's happening, which I think is at the crux of this, is that the language that we use to share information with each other is not natural. It's the farthest freaking thing from natural. Like it's a true technology invention departure from nature in good ways and bad ways. But one of the bad ways is that all of a sudden you assume that because someone can't formulate a proper explanation to something, that whatever their experience is invalid or somehow lesser than. And really what we're doing is like, we first experience it and everything that you felt and everything that goes into it. But the process of them breaking all that down into little objective statements that you can then give to somebody else for them to digest, it forces you to break things down into objective little parts. And not necessarily everything that happens in our heads is completely objective. So every time you decide on a word to use, you're sort of like collapsing a function, right? The function is like this open-ended, it could be anything, any number of them. But once you pick that word means something. And then the word that you picked determines what the next word that you pick is going to be. And it keeps going on. We're basically big AI chatbots that are just like constantly searching for the next word and kind of forgetting what happens before that. So I really... This isn't as fun maybe as like reptilians and Bigfoot and Thrill Oxide, but I really do think this is like one of the more important things is for people to think in these terms. Like if I can't explain this in a just regular English sentence to another person, then maybe my thought isn't complete, or maybe go into a room by yourself and hash it out before, you go into like a big, chat room of like 100 people and then just start dropping stuff that's based on like a feeling and then not being able to back it up. Not because you're wasting their time, but because maybe you're wasting your time because you're not even sure what you think yet.
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the phenomenon that I've been experiencing over the course of the last 20 plus years, right, is people who used to think I was crazy, like now are willing to take a look at what I'm talking about, whether I'm talking about my own personal story or whether I'm talking about what's going on in the world. And some of those people are family members or longtime friends or whatever. And it isn't so much that like they've woken up or the events of the world have now convinced them that their opinions before were wrong. It's that I have done, I think, a good job of really working hard on like caring about what I'm saying enough to like to try and to clarify my thoughts and then clarify the way I'm able to explain them to people. So when someone like my dad, who's a very educated man, right, and who has very different opinions about things going on in the world than I do, can look and go, okay, she has been working on like this information, whether it's her research or her understanding her own experiences for this long, right? Like the amount of care that I've gone into, like not leaving any stone uncovered and then trying to come back and find ways to explain it to him so that he can understand and to correlate it to things that I know he does understand or care about or whatever, like this person is serious. And so I'm willing to take a look at what she's saying. And that isn't like, well, we would love to think that, oh, people are waking up or whatever it is. The most meaningful way that you can like affect people's like desire to care about what you're talking about is by taking time and care yourself and working on how you present the information that's important to you and not just splattering it out there and then not feeling like you need to follow up and make it more concise and work on it and find different ways for people to understand it. If what you're saying is important, like find a way to communicate it to people that will, you know, allow them to care.
And you said that you got really heavy into like the rave scene, and as you were talking, especially as you compared it to MK Ultra and Losses of Time and like meeting people, the first thing I started thinking of was maybe Operation Midnight Climax, where they were, you know, giving drugs to just random people and seeing what would affect their, you know, their behavior based on that. And then the Hate Ashbury, where the CIA would just like set up houses and it's like, hey, you can just come and chill in this house and do drugs or do whatever you want. Safe place. Just, you know, there might be a guy in the room recording you and taking notes, but just don't pay attention to him. I mean, would it be so far-fetched to think that maybe like these underground raves that were going and, you know, accepting, you know, like the many minors would show up and just be doing all sorts of drugs and dancing all night? Who's to say that wasn't like a CIA operation where they were just recording and observing, you know, how these drugs that were mainly researched and brought to the public by intelligence agencies, how they had an effect in these bigger social settings?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts on this, and it has like, you know, morphed and changed and shifted over time. Like I, you know, first started going to raves in the mid to late 90s, right? And I'm still very actively involved in the underground dance music scene. Like I am very much more selective and specific about what I like and what I want to listen to or do or participate in. And I go less, you know, frequently, right? Like there was a time when I went out 3, 4, 5 times a week. And now like, you know, if I can get a few good parties a year, that's good for me. Like if I have a great night, then it's like, wow, that's satisfying for quite a long time. Right. Like, just like when you have, you know, when you have a satisfying experience, it's like, I'm going to relish this one for a while and like, you know, not kind of go and do another one until like I'm feeling that pull again, right? Whereas before it was like social. I wanted to be at everything. I didn't want to miss anything and all that kind of stuff, right? So yes, I think that all music scenes, right, have this is true of on some level, right? That they're being either created for and then observed, or if they are sort of organic in their you know, appearance, the way that they've come up, later people figure out that something interesting is going on here and we should go either observe and then after we've observed, decide if there's anything to do about it. What can we learn? Can we manipulate it? Can we this, that, or the other thing, right? The dance music scene is unique, and there's many like different segments of the dance music scene. It's not like one cohesive, coherent, unified type of thing. There's like a very commercial, you know, level of it, and then there's a very, very underground level of it, and then there's everything in between. There's many different styles of electronic music that each have their own scenes and flavors built around them. There's a club scene. There's, you know, there's many permutations, and each sort of allows for different possibilities, right? And so I can't answer the question as to whether this was created or discovered, right? Like if someone in intelligence or a military contractor or something else, came up with this idea, or whether this occurred naturally, and then somebody's like, oh, look what these people are doing over here, right? Let's go play with this. But there are so many things to be gleaned, observed, learned from the experience that people have with not just music, but with frequency and stimulation in general, and operating in an environment that is that dynamic, right? That it's impossible that that's not happening, right? And so I think we shouldn't limit ourselves to like one idea of what is going on there. And I think that there was an oversimplification when people first started questioning, and I probably participated in this oversimplification, when people first started questioning what was really going on with, raves or electronic music in general or whatnot. And then, sometimes when like a narrative that strikes people in a certain way, like in a similar way that narratives about, child trafficking or whatever strike people want to hold on to that narrative, and it starts to frame everything they see like around that. And it is either a long time or a lot of work. And in some cases it never happens, that they are willing to sort of step away from that perspective and start to look at it from some other angles to see like what else could be going on here. And I think that there is, imagine it like a university, right? That has lots of buildings, and in those buildings there are lots of classrooms or labs, and in those labs there's several desks, and in each place like different experiments and different things are going on, and some have a lot of attention on them, and some are just someone really tinkering around and no one really cares what's going on until someone does and whatnot. And it's very much the same thing with any of these sort of counterculture or outside the norm scenes. But there's almost no occasion where I don't start scratching around or the surface of something and find like a lot of the same. When I say players, I don't mean like the same person exactly, but the same whiff of like this company or that technology, or this person has parents who work for this, or there's always that there. And so then the question becomes, is this like some, I don't know if malevolent is the term, but is this some experience that's being directed, or is this something that it's like, all right, well, kids are going to do what they're going to do, and we'll just make the things available for them to do that, and then we'll look and see what happens, and we'll like collect information from that. I don't know, right? But what I do know is that you also can use that environment to study things about yourself, other people, like, various technologies, both like physical and metaphysical, that we exist with in this world, and start to understand various ways that things can work, and make yourself sort of your own experiment, right? Your own sort of, that's the one thing, is like, we definitely have the right as human beings here. We're all here. We can do what we want with our bodies and our consciousness, right? And that is, if that's all you're doing, if you're just doing it with yourself and to yourself, that's moral, right? You have a right to understand what's going on inside of you and around you, as long as you're not interfering with other people. And so I use it for that opportunity.
When someone says like, my body is a temple, can you not do experiments in a temple? Like, isn't that what transubstantiation's all about? You're like doing some alchemical work in that temple. Who's to say that can't be the same thing with like neon glow sticks and, like cat paw or like cat ear headbands and stuff. And I like your analogy of like a university, and it's got all these buildings and stuff. And also that there's this spectrum that goes from super commercial to like the underground. So in the late 90s, or let's say at the peak of whatever you considered your career as like a, like a raver to be, what was like the most underground, top secret, in the basement of the university stuff that was going on?
Like at the peak of it, I mean, at the peak of it, I didn't know all the things I know now. So like, it's really hard for me to like,
I guess in retrospect, if you were to think back and be like, wow, that I was part of something that was like super deep, or I got to witness this key moment that nobody even realized, like, I saw the guy invent, candy flipping for the first time. I don't know.
So I would say that like the couple of things, right? Like I definitely observed intelligence, interaction, and interference in the party scene, right? And I definitely like know some of those players, right? And also like could clearly see how like things are compartmentalized, and that like someone thinks that they're doing one thing and they don't quite understand how what they're doing is being used for something else. And then the way that they will justify the way that they kind of refuse to see it or justify their actions once they discover that something is going on. And it is pretty interesting to watch that. So I definitely saw the scene here in Austin get pretty infiltrated by some level of law enforcement or intelligence agencies in this weird way, where it felt like they were at some point they were involved in the throwing of the events, right? Like,
do you have any specific examples that you'd be comfortable sharing?
So, like, there's been definitely people who were party promoters that were throwing parties, that were in charge of large scale events, that were doing things that were clearly acting as like informants for law enforcement or intelligence agencies. And they weren't just like some off to the side person. It was usually like somebody with like very large pull. Right. And I didn't have the eyes then that I have now. Right. And it's that a lot of information has been scraped from the internet about some of that stuff. So I can't easily go back and look and make more sense of it. But, it's really expensive to do events, and you can ask anybody who is a small time promoter or small time person who throws parties that it's almost impossible to make money. Right. And so when you are seeing large amounts of money come into a scene and being unclear on where that's coming from, right? Like, like I know how hard it is to pull it for people who really care about this to pull off a good event. Right. And so even people who are like the most true to the music and the sound and what their vision of things and whatever, like oftentimes have to take money from people that, they would prefer to not have to go asking for money from. And so then when you scale that up to the size of events that we're going now, everything is really festival based, right? There isn't really a rave scene anymore. Now there's an underground and a festival scene. Whereas before there was like this thing called the rave scene that was kind of bigger than the underground scene, but smaller than the festival scene, right? So the amount of money that's going into all of this, like, doesn't just show up from people that don't have agendas that aren't only about making money, right? So, but the biggest thing for me is the experiences that I had at the Austin City Music Hall, right? Which is it's no longer there. It is now the Proper Hotel, which, like, rumor has it that like Elon Musk might live there at least part-time, right? And there's like an apartment section of it. And it's very interesting where it's located. And when I was going to the Austin City Music Hall, I didn't understand like all the things I do now, but I didn't even know what was behind the Austin City Music Hall. And that is the Austin City Power Plant and Shoal Creek, which is like a huge bed of limestone, right? And some of the other things that were sort of in the area. Like I was just like going to the place, parking, going to the party. I wasn't like exploring the area around it. And now it's completely different than it was then. But I would say there in the late 90s and early 2000s, I had my first, what I would consider to be like outside of time or outside of body events that I've now been able to sort of like circle back on, right? In terms of like, I now understand things like the gateway experience. I understand, and whether people think that was like that Robert Monroe is good or bad, or what the military or CIA or whatever is doing with that. Some of the processes that are described in there make sense, and lots of people have been able to experience that. But basically, I think what is over there is like some sort of interesting soft spot or vortexy portal kind of thing that allows for some degree of distortion of like the space-time continuum, because I had experiences there that don't make sense, that connect me to my time in Austin now. Right. And I started having some of these weird experiences immediately when I moved back here in 2021, where things that like visions or ideas or information that I seemed to grab out of the ether back in the late 90s or 2000s, the moment that would explain it was happening then in 2021. And it was in that particular area. Like all of these experiences are in a specific defined geographical location, right? And when I look and see all the things that are there now, right, I'm like, oh, these people, they know what this is, and they all want to be stacked right here. And they're using this to sort of, their advantage for like a variety of things. But, back then it was a bunch of kids going there, listening to this music, like having with a lot of sound and a lot of light and a lot of drugs, and having all kinds of like fascinating and crazy experiences that at the time we thought were just our trips. Right. But the trips are different in different places. Right. And there was definitely some kind of like, it's like an amplifier or an accelerating kind of effect. I talked about this quite a bit on Esoteric America. I did a couple episodes with them last year about my experiences here in Austin, where I went into sort of depth about that. But I do think that sound and light, and then things that sort of facilitate our ability to pay attention at a different level than we normally do. So either defocalize or hyperfocalize are probably better places to look for the kind of experiences that that we think are like about big machinery or, something different, right? Like I do think that things like temporal travel or temporal distortion, however you think about that, or spatial distortion, dimensional travel, all that kind of stuff have a lot more to do with like sound and light and then the condition of your body and sort of where your focus is at than it does about like, rockets or, gigantic, machines, although you can do it that way as well. But I think the technology is all based on alchemical and spiritual and metaphysical practices. And then doing like what you said, creating some way of proving it, replicating it, and being able to do it in a variety of places. But I think the earth is part of this, right? Like I think the ground that we stand on, like whatever is there, is part, like facilitates what experiences you can have when you bring in these other factors, right? Like frequency and sound and light and all that kind of stuff.
How does, whenever someone brings up like temporal anomalies or like maybe this concept of what I'm doing now is influencing what I did before and vice versa, and I've heard this, I'll paraphrase it horribly, but that like your opinions today are influenced because like the things that you prefer, the things that you've already done. So it's like you think that you're making this decision because you want it, but really you're making the decision because that's what already happened, and you have to make that. So where are you at currently on like the free will thing? Because it seems like something you might bounce around. Like maybe I do have free will, maybe I have no free will.
I mean, I guess I don't necessarily think about it in terms of free will or not free will, but like this was like a question. We really started tinkering with this like at the very beginning of lockdown when Mike Luan and I first started working together, right? And we started to notice like an uptick in synchronicity. And we were trying to figure out like if we were generating them or if we were like magnetically attracted to them on some level, right? So were we having crazy things happen in the external world? Like we would talk about something and then like it would show itself in a million different ways, so bizarrely, so immediately afterwards, right? And was it happening because we talked about it, or were we talking about it because somehow we could already sense that was coming, right? do right, and what, and we read this. There's a book called Synchronicity by F. David Pete that I think is really interesting in like understanding how synchronicity is part of like the underlying structure and pattern of the universe, right? Which doesn't necessarily give you this like direct path to like be able to create one or to be able to know one is coming, but that this sort of enfolding and unfolding of reality is sort of connected to, once an idea is out there, it will express itself in many, many, many different ways. And also when something's about to happen, people will start paying attention on a level that they wouldn't otherwise. Like our systems are geared towards that, right? So as far as free will, like the only thing that I think really is that we have free will of choice when things are happening in the moment, like of how we can react to something, right? Like, but I do think that like overall, like we are being like guided or steered like in specific directions. And so it's kind of like you're going to eat dinner, but are you going to eat chicken or steak or whatever? Or are you going to eat a vegan meal? But right, like kind of thing. There's small decisions that are to a certain extent an exercise of choice or will. The bigger question is something external to us guiding this or steering us, or is it in some way ourselves that are doing it? And I don't know. Like at moments it feels there was definitely a time when I thought I was much more under control of something or someone else than I feel now, right? But it's not necessarily completely stable. Like I don't never feel that. Like some of the shit that happens is like so weird. It feels like almost impossible if the scenario wasn't set up or staged or controlled in some external way. But, I don't know. Like I know there's a big debate about whether people have free will or don't have free will. I guess I don't think about it in those terms, and maybe I should sometimes for the exercise of doing it. But it is crazy how many things we do without thinking about it, how much autopilot we are on. And if that is evidence that there is not really the free will in the way we think about it, then maybe there's something to that.
Well, we've got another 3 days and 23 hours to get to the bottom of this. So I say we just hunker. And I've got another theory to just throw into the ring here. Not even something I'm developing, but it's something that just kind of like makes sense, is that maybe more chaos brings more synchronicity in one of two ways. One, if you want to get all like, woo-woo about it, you could say that, there's like this karmic balance, so that more chaos means that more things also have to. But also, if you want to ignore the woo-woo part, if you introduce a human to just nonstop chaos environment where like nothing makes sense, nothing's predictable, you will just automatically, your brain will be grasping for the first like nuance of order that it can find. So in times of chaos, like a lockdown for multiple years that no one was expecting, and it completely upsets everything you expect, now everything feels so chaotic that your brain might be like hyper focusing on things that aren't chaotic or that have synchronicities or that just match up in weird ways. So I don't even know if it's necessarily like more synchronicities are happening, but like your brain is latching on to way more than it normally would, because there's no other. This is like almost a mind control tactic, where if you put someone to a constant state of unpredictability, like sleep deprivation is the best one, then all of a sudden they'll just be the most suggestible person in the world. And there's also something to be said here about once we make society extra convenient. So if you imagine way back in the day when everyone had like a god for every little nuanced thing, like there was a god for rain and a god for fertilizer and a god for everything, then that might be a very chaotic time, and you would just inherently realize patterns in nature, and you would just notice like, oh, when these stars are like this, or when the waves are like this thing happens, because again, it's like the only structure there is. But now you fast forward to today, and everything is structured and prepackaged and made like so convenient that now we might just not see even like 1/100th of the synchronicities that all of our ancestors had always seen. And it's not because they were like more in tune with nature or anything. It was just that their brains were constantly searching for things to make sense of the world. And now we kind of have it served up to us. And we've, got these preconceived notions within the first few years of gestation at this point.
Yeah, no, I think those are all good points. I mean, what you were saying about our brain, like reaching to grab like a heat seeking missile, right? Like anything that makes sense, like let's go there.
Or like a drought, like someone drowning, right?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, right. So there's also like what you said about, okay, with the lockdown that brought all this chaos. So people are seeking that. The flip side of that, right, is like we live in a increasingly complex, chaotic world where there's so many things to pay attention to, that what lockdown did on some level was simplify a lot of things. So we were now able to see all of these synchronicities that we weren't able to see before, and understand that, like, wait a second, there's almost like an algorithmic like unfolding or predictability of the way things happen. And as soon as like some of the chaos and noise and background characters or whatever were cleared off the board, you can see it in a way that like is not obvious when you're dealing with the noise and riffraff of everyday life, right? Like there's many ways you can look at it. Like to me, lockdown did not feel particularly chaotic because I wasn't scared, right? Like whenever you're scared, everything feels more frenetic and chaotic or whatever it is. And I happened to be living in Los Angeles at that time where there's just people everywhere all the time. But all of a sudden in lockdown, there was like no one on the streets anywhere. Like trips that would take me 2 hours in my car normally were taking me 12 minutes and like, whatever. So you could basically see the structure or the backbone or the scaffolding of things much more clearly and really start to observe like what things look like and how they worked and where things actually were. And there was a lot less noise. But if my own personal disposition during that time were different, I could see how it would have been the way you said. So I think so much of this is not about how things are, but about how you are. And then it's like a back and forth between those two things. And both things are constantly shifting and evolving and whatnot. And that the sort of the junction of those two, the relationship between those two things is the point that we're really talking about here. And it's kind of like this self-transforming machine elf of a reality, if you will, right?
To me, the lockdown is like a topic of endless fascination. And it's funny, we have to like dance around like what words you want to say about it. Like the lockdown in particular, I'm still just today and as I go realizing more and more how significant it was for so many people. But to me, it just felt like, another Monday, and not that nothing changed, but it just felt like was always coming. It was always going to happen. It wasn't too much different like than the avian thing that had happened in the 90s and everyone was stocking up on Tamiflu and stuff. But what really surprised me is how many people used the lockdown as like their moment of waking up, where it was like, I finally realized that, something crazy is going on worldwide and there's coordination and I guess one thing good, I mean, it's a net positive, I think, in a lot of ways that kind of woke people up, but also it scares me a little bit because to me, the lockdown felt like if this were a situation where like we're the kid and the government is the parent in like the most juvenile way, lockdown wasn't even getting grounded. That was like, go sit in the corner and you're not allowed to listen to music for a couple hours. But like, we haven't even seen the spankings or the beatings yet. And if it took, getting grounded first to even wake up, but some people aren't going to wake up even when they start the spankings, you know what I mean? And when I say spankings, I mean, like when the state exerts its one and only true power, which is they're allowed to legally use violence and nobody else is. That's kind of where the rubber meets the road on all of this. And we haven't even really seen that. I mean, you saw almost like an economic violence and economic coercion, but we haven't seen like the actual coercion yet. And I'm not a prophecy speaker or even like a doomsdayer whatsoever. Like I completely resonate with you that while you're looking into this stuff, like don't also exclude all the cool things that you can do and like the enjoyment that you've got and like laughing at stuff. But huge but
But what you said, so that's 100% true that a lot of people used the lockdown to finally wake up. And on the flip side of that, lots of people used the lockdown to go to sleep once and for good. Right. Like I know people who like gave up the last thing that they liked doing in all of reality during the lockdown, and they'll never do it again. Right. Like lots of people. Right. And so for like, just like we were talking about before, that like, you can look at it from this direction or you can look at it from that direction. And it just kind of depends on how you were in that moment. Like whatever that was, whether it felt like a serious shock to your system or if it was just like a tiny little reverberation that like you barely noticed or whatever, like whatever your system did with that. And for me, just like you, like it was kind of like, ho hum, whatever, dude, like, but I did use that time to do things that had the world continued in its normal way, I would not have had time to do.
That's a great point.
So I made good use of that time. So in that sense, like it had an effect on me. But there was no moment during that where like I felt like really, really scared or really, really bothered, other than that, like, unfortunately, some relationships broke down during that time, or difficult moments came up in relationships. And that's always uncomfortable, no matter if you're a conspiracy theorist or a sleeping normie or anything in between. That's challenging. But I also learned that like, okay, like there's a lot of things that you can live through that you thought would be heartbreaking or devastating and you wouldn't be able to live through, but like you're able to continue and find meaning in life, and it is what it is. Right. So yeah, but it's fascinating.
I'm cringing at myself for even saying this, but I swear I feel like a pokey poke hipster, because even when I was in the military in the late night or in the early 2000s, I was rejecting all the weird wanted to give to us. Like I went through lots of hoops. I got in a lot of trouble. I got an Article 15. I got an LOR, which is a letter of reprimand, for like not taking certain, like I had to get an anthrax shot because they wanted to send me overseas. Yeah. And I jumped through so many hoops to like not get it, to the point where I got in trouble for not getting it. But like at the point when everything started popping off in, early 2000, like no one that knew me had any question what side of the aisle I was on, because I had already put myself into like legal issues with the state because I didn't want to do something similar that they were now doing on like a big platform. So it was kind of like, I felt like I had been training for this moment. Like I joked about that. Like I've been training for this moment my whole life. Like I can be alone for years if I need to be. I don't need the external attention. And that was another really weird thing, that you started seeing people, a lot of podcasts popping up, and some of it was because people were waking up. But I think a lot of it too was just like, people were used to having an audience and going to the office and having the water cooler banter and being the center of attention and having all of their thoughts validated. And now it was like everyone jumped to social media, and that just kind of threw fuel on the fire with all the like TikTok and everything, because now I can keep getting the attention that I used to go out and get out in the clubs, or maybe I dress up and go out shopping or window shopping just for the attention. And now you don't get that. And like the celebrities were the worst, right? They're all like covering songs, and it's like, can you guys not just fade into obscurity for 2 years and just live with yourself? You know what I mean? And I think the answer is no. A lot of people can't live with themselves for extended periods of time.
It's interesting what you said. So first of all, I can imagine you would get in a lot of trouble in the military, because you always have this smile on your face, no matter, you have like this infectious grin and smile that like, whether you're smiling because you're happy or like, I could see somebody trying to discipline
Big problems,
you, you smiling like that,
so
and then just wanting to fucking kill you. It's part of what I love about you, right? I love your smile. Like I love your jovial laugh and whatever, but I can see how that would create like a level of shit for you that.
Well, what's even worse is I've got my neutral face, but it's like resting, like jerk face.
You're like Happy Buddha. You're like Happy Buddha.
Real quick one. Hold on. And
you're
that's
about
completely.
To smile.
That's totally neutral, right? But I realized for the first 2 years in the military, I'm a very slow learner. Trust me, it takes me forever to learn something, but I learn it for good. But I remember I was just like, everyone keeps telling me I've got attitude, and I knew deep inside like I don't have attitude. Like I'll do whatever you tell me. I'm not like. And then at some point I realized that I had this resting like jerk face, and all I had to do was lift my eyebrows, and I practiced in the mirror, and I was like, okay, how do I get rid of this? And I found what I had to do, and it was like overnight I just stopped getting in trouble for having attitude. And this is a tangent. This all I did is I raised my eyebrows a little bit. So look at the difference here. I'll try my best not to smile.
All right.
Here's my resting bitch face. And then here's the eyebrows version. Watch.
Oh yeah.
All of a sudden, I'm receptive as opposed to being like a little stink face jerk that's like, scowling at you.
One looks dismissive of authority and the other one looks enthralled or scared of authority. Right. And so that's exactly it. Yeah.
And it was like a freaking cheat code that was just like, okay. So anyways, I had nonstop problem. It wasn't just that I didn't want them to put anything into my body. It was like everything.
Yeah. What you said about you were okay with being by yourself. Like one of the things that, some of my previous experiences in my life that a lot of people would think of as not being positive, like prolonged drug addiction and drug use. Like I spent, many, many years of my life really basically like locked in my apartment by myself doing drugs. I wasn't a big partier when my heavy drug use came after the peak of the party scene. It was kind of like when that died down, like something else sort of opened up. And my years of heavy meth use, I mostly spent by myself. And that was actually where a lot of my like research and things that we talk about now got done. It was almost like I had a drug fueled dive into every rabbit hole and conspiracy. And, like on some levels, one would go, okay, was that affecting your perception and your ability to discern about these things? And I think that's fair. But somehow, like I came to a lot of the same conclusions as very sober-minded researchers. And for me, what it really more felt like was it helped sort of focus my attention in one place, not an endorsement of drugs, but also anesthetized me to the disturbing things you discover about the reality that we live in, so that I was able to continue to look as opposed to get so upset that like my curiosity stopped there. And then it was when I stopped doing drugs, having to sort of, come to terms with it in different ways and decide like what still resonated and what didn't and what made sense and what not. But I spent a lot of time by myself in my own head, right? And whether this is not an endorsement of using drugs, but when you spend a lot of time by yourself on drugs, you get to know yourself in a way that you would not get to know yourself if you never did that. And the flip side of that is you also, are in denial of certain things about yourself that ultimately you're going to have to deal with if you're going to kind of, move past whatever, sort of state phase you're sort of stuck in. But when lockdown came, like it wasn't any different. Like basically for many, many years, I was on a self-imposed lockdown in my apartment where I only left to get, food, water on the occasions that I was coming down, and maybe occasionally socialize with someone or try to get work when I was in a period of not being on drugs. Right. So the idea of spending that much time either by myself or only with one other person, because a lot of times you find yourself doing drugs with one other person or two other people, like that was fine for me. Right. I didn't feel like scared about not having all that sort of interaction or feedback from other people. But the point you're talking about, even like dumb stuff, right? Like the celebrity thing you're talking about, that was ridiculous. But even my dad, right? Like he felt that he felt the need to update me constantly on the things they either were doing or weren't doing, like according to the rules and stuff like that. So here you have a person who knows that I don't agree, and that also I don't care. And also by that point, I was flexible enough that someone could do something different than me, and that's fine. Like I'm not going to try and change their mind, but had to like validate that they were like doing all the things that they should be doing, kind of like you would validate with your boss at work. Like, okay, got this done now, right? It was fucking weird. Like this need for constantly checking and validating like the reality with other people. And it was something that told me exactly what you're saying, that people have a really hard time being isolated by themselves or in very small groups of people for a long time. And then there's some people who love it. There's some people who are antisocial, and the lockdown was like the best thing ever for them because they didn't have to, they could just completely sink into their, that part of their personality that like doesn't want to interact in the outer world. And many of them are not leaving their house now that, now that they can. Right. So it was definitely a fascinating social experiment to observe.
Round one. That was round one of the experiment. We'll see what happens in rounds 2, 3, 4, and 5 pretty soon.
Right.
And also, to be very clear, not advocating for drug use for anybody. Although Sigmund Freud, who probably was a jerk in his own right, but he had some really interesting thoughts on, for example, like cocaine, fill in the blank with any drug that you want to put in here, but that it's, and I'm going to paraphrase beyond anything that he said, but this is where I originally remember him writing about how he found use for it, like an actual medical professional use, where it's like, if you were onto something and you were also tired, here's the risk is like, okay, you can go to sleep, but you might wake up in a completely different mindset. You might like the thought might be fleeting. And if you've got like that tiger by the tail, maybe you don't want to let go of it. So in that case, there are some tools that you can use, just like, superpowered coffee or Jolt Cola or caffeine pills. There's levels, right? And far under that level, you could legitimately say, I'm onto something right now, and I want to stay awake for the next 3 or 4 days and see this through. And there's tools that allow you to do that.
I mean,
and I think there's validity to that. And it's not like it's a good, like you're not doing a good thing to your body, but it's a tool that you're using for like an ends to a very real project. So it's not all partying. Sometimes it's like function based.
I would say that 90% of my drug use has been not in a party situation. Right. And that's exactly what I did. Whether I understood, I wasn't sitting there going like, I'm going to start using drugs so that I can do that. But that seemed to be the rhythm I fell into, is that when I was doing drugs, I spent a good portion of the time doing research. And what that allowed me to do was excavate the entire rabbit hole in one sitting, as opposed to spending a year in the same rabbit hole, but having to like leave and do other stuff and come back and do a little bit when I had time. Like I could get on a topic and literally get to the, like as far as you could go with like links and connect the dots and stuff like that on the internet. At that time, the internet was much bigger than it is now, right? I could get all the way to the bottom of that rabbit hole. And then, whatever, I might revisit things that were, seemingly the most important or whatever, but I could really scope something out. And then the other thing, and I don't know if this correlates with what you said, Freud was talking about this.
Sigmund Freud, I think he was like an advocate of using cocaine in particular as like a professional tool.
Okay, so I was mostly I had to go around with cocaine, but that was before I discovered that there was layers of reality that we weren't aware of in our everyday life, right? I was mostly using meth when I was doing this. And there was something about meth, and it's weird because this went for obtaining meth as well, right? Where I was able to find the needle in the haystack, and it was almost like my mind knew what things to not pay attention to and what things to pay attention to in my pursuit of finding more meth, in the same way with information, right? Like I was able to very quickly go through a lot of information and decide what things seemed important and what things didn't, in a way that has been largely validated by the way things have played out in the world, because a lot of this was happening before it was more broadly known about certain things, but also in terms of how many times I've referred back to research I did during that time when looking at things that seemingly have nothing to do with it. But because I learned that valid point there, it was like I sought that out. That seemed important. My mind grabbed onto it. I didn't forget. And like later when something else comes up, I'm able to go to information that now people would have a hard time finding, because you have to go through the steps to get to it. But if you already know it exists, different ways to query it to be able to grab it again. And my mind is very good at connecting those things. So there's something about the level of focus that it brings. And the other thing about drugs, and I don't have experience with all drugs, I only know the ones that I've done, right? But in terms of what we're talking about here in relationship to like, going through a lot of information quickly or finding something that is kind of way off the board generally, right? And like, oh, well, look at this. that when you are on drugs, you're in it like it's like a phase shift. You're resonating at a different frequency than what is your normal resting rate or your normal range. We're not always in the same place, right? And so your attention is drawn to things in a different way. And I think that part of the reason drugs are there's so much around drugs, like there's like, they've been demonized, or then when they're glorified in a specific and controlled way, is because I think that changing the sort of this kind of phase shift or this sort of a frequency band that you most closely resonate with, and so the one that you sort of zoom in on, would be evidence of much more to reality, either many more realities or many more complexities or layers to the reality that we're in than it's convenient for people to be aware of on a completely holistic level, right? And so, this isn't an endorsement of something being good or bad, but if you actually listen to the accounts of people on drugs, oftentimes who don't know each other, are in different parts of the world and care about different things, the consistency of things that they experience and see is evidence that is something that actually exists and not simply a projection of the mind. Because why would people who have nothing else in common be projecting the exact same hallucination unless there was some basis for it in reality?
I've heard one good answer to that question before, and it took, and I remember this. There's a shout out to Tristan Irwin, but his answer to that was they'd have one important thing in common. They all have the same evolved human brain. So even though the culture separates us, maybe there's something inherent with just the structure of the brain itself and the rest of our bodies that explains like all of these similarities that pop up, that on one end might seem like we're all touching this elephant, that like this ethereal elephant, we're all feeling different parts of it, so we can't necessarily describe it in the same way, but it's the same thing. Or maybe it's just like I think what they call form constants. And this is like the classification of, some people see cobwebs, some people see spirals, some people see fractals, but those might be related to just regular patterns that our brains use to like encode information to it. Now, I don't know. I don't think I'd prescribe to that exact definition, but it's an interesting way to think about it, that maybe that also explains that there's not, clockwork gnomes out there, or like lady salvia entities. Maybe there's just like this weird itch, like we all got a weird salvia G spot or a weird LSG G spot, and everyone can hit it in different ways. I don't know if I subscribe to that either, but I certainly wouldn't exclude it. But even if that were the explanation, right, then a deep study of what exactly that is and how that is also affecting our perception of what they say the real reality is in order. Right. Because that brings into question everything else as well. So I love that. I love that conversation. Right. So even though that's not where my mind first goes, like my mind goes to something different than that. Like if he could make that argument compelling and we could get into, a really interesting discussion about it. I love considering that. I love, having someone with an opinion that is very, very different of mine, but interesting enough that I care about it and am willing to try it on for size here and there. And if I become convinced that that's like a more attractive outfit, then I'll be willing to wear that, right? Or whatever it is, right? Or if that fits better. I love that. So, but yeah, even within that, if that is the case, then there is some other bit of information that we need to know about what our brain process is and how symbols interact, right, with sort of like narrative construction and understanding of like linear occurrences or whatever that would make our experience here seem completely different than it does now. There's another thing too that I only read recently, and it would totally open my mind up a little bit more to like the psychedelic experience in particular. But this research by Dr. Abram Hoffer that I did in my thrill oxide research, but he led me onto this big path where I wanted to understand like what is actually happening in the brain, because there was reports of some people that naturally were just constantly having a psychedelic trip just in normal life. And it was because, like, in one specific example, it was because the person was eating apples because they lived by like an apple orchard or something. And something, I think it was the folic acid maybe that was in the apples, was just constantly triggering something in their body to overproduce all sorts of chemicals, serotonin and GABA and all these things. And that, like, just bombardment of serotonin where their body was reacting weird, almost like an allergy, was causing them to trip constantly. So they stopped eating apples, went away. He also found out a lot of people that were having similar symptoms, if he gave them vitamin B3 or niacin, that it also would suppress it. And this is the guy that actually is like the father of enriched cereal. So you go to the cereal and it's got like iron and niacin and all this stuff. Like, it's kind of, he's sort of the father of all of that. But his research led me down this weird rabbit hole where it was making a really strong statement that a lot of people confuse the inebriation and sort of like the good feelings, right, as the spiritual part and like the spiritual experience. But that the real aspect of that makes your mind open up and available to new things and seeing things in new lights might have absolutely nothing to do with the inebriation and the hallucinations and any of that. All that's really happening is the extra, neuroplasticity, I think, is when your neurons are able to like connect to other neurons they wouldn't have necessarily connected to. They can go a little bit extra longer. And that's the real part that's making your mind open up, and everything else is secondary. But so many people are overwhelmed and obsessed with that secondary like side effect that they completely ignore that there's like almost like a sober version of doing the same thing.
I agree with that, right? Like, I think that over time, like, my psychedelic experiences and insights have become much more like my everyday observations and experiences and insights. Like, if someone remarked how, like, when they were listening to me talk when I was on like a lot of mushrooms, it sounded like I was doing a podcast. It didn't sound like I was right kind of thing. So they didn't understand because they could barely talk, and I just sounded like I was doing a podcast. So I think that's right. Like, I think that, so I also do nutrition consultation and have, I'm a certified nutrition consultant, and I've looked at the body and nutrition and all this kind of stuff from many different angles. And what you said about B3, like, a lot of people are deficient in vitamin B3 and vitamin C, and almost all of those people are what we call schizophrenic or bipolar, or have something that we have pathologized as a psychiatric disorder, when really it is a deficiency in some sort of mineral or vitamin or whatever. And if you simply give the person that, right? And oftentimes you have to adjust the diet as well, because these things tend to correlate with people having what's called saccharin disease or low blood sugar disease. So most people who are mentally ill have a weird relationship with sugar and are deficient or overproducing of something because of that, like their body's overreacting or underreacting or something like that. And probably 90% of the things that we call psychiatric illness or some sort of disorder can be, dealt with just by addressing it orthomolecularly or orthonutritionally, right? And what you're talking about like the neurons and all of that kind of stuff, that is 100% correct, right? Because when we're having neurochemical or biophysical kinds of things go on in our body, right? Like, our consciousness is perceiving that, right? But it perceives that in a way that we can understand it. And that is through story, right? That is through story. And when some of these things are happening, like, no one's thinking about when they're tripping that, like, what's my blood sugar? Like, right, kind of thing. Like, what did I eat today or whatever it is? It's just like you're in the story or the narrative of whatever it is, right? And, I've found differences when I don't eat or don't drink anything when I'm tripping, or when I only drink water, or if I drink something sweet, because there comes a time, like when the mushrooms are coming on in a certain way, where you almost feel slightly faint. And if you take something sweet at that point, or you don't take something sweet, that does affect the trip in small ways, not like in super large ways, but you can feel that, right? And right now you have like a lot of people doing microdosing, right? And there's like this blurring of realities because you're doing all the things you would normally do, and you're under the influence of not only the mushroom, but in some cases the microdosing protocols call for things like lion's mane and niacin, different things that also affect what's going on. Like literally, I think that I had a really crazy microdosing experience. And at this point, I think it doesn't have anything to do with the mushrooms. It had to do with the niacin and the lion's mane, right? And the difference when I took mushrooms with lion's mane, and lion's mane is also mushrooms, but they're supposedly not psychedelic. I might disagree with that, right? But the difference in the experience of taking psychedelic mushrooms with lion's mane and niacin and just taking them by themselves was vast. And that goes to what you're talking about. There's all kinds of, the body's a very complex system, and not everything that's happening is because of the one thing that you knowingly think you did, right? And then also like the story your mind is telling yourself about how your body is sort of unraveling whatever that is.
So I've been just taking notes on like little tangents that I want to go on, but we'll have to save it for the next 23-hour segment that will continue.
All right.
This is going to go on for another 3 days. Here's just a smattering of the little notes that we'll have to get into on the next talk here. But stimulants versus ketosis. I've got a whole tangent on this.
Yeah.
Haunted raves. I'm curious that the amount of energy and the amount of deaths that happen in raves, are there like ghosts that are still like candy flipping out there? We'll talk about that. 432 versus 440 and cymatics. That seems like an interesting and relevant conversation.
Yep.
I wanted to know about secret societies in the dance scene, and that could even include like a little group of drug dealers that are throwing a party and taking all the benefits. Young versus old drug use. Very touchy subject, but there's a huge difference because A, your brain's still developing, but B, you have absolutely no real world responsibilities other than homework and get back home alive, versus when you're old enough to have the responsibility to do it and your brain's not developing. Well, now you might have a mortgage to pay, or you might have a kid to take care of, or like it's two different worlds. We'll get into that. I want to know what class and teacher you were in that brought up MK Ultra in high school. That blows my mind.
It was in college, but I'll tell you, yeah.
And then, we'll get into it. And I want to talk about demons. I want to talk about salvia. I want to talk about a bunch of stuff, but we're gonna save that for hour 23 in our 4-day nonstop. The Guinness people, just go and take a pee break. We'll be back. But so
I look forward to all of those conversations. Yes,
we'll do all of them. Before we get into anything else, we got a really quick segment.
Hey, conspiracy buffs, I double dare you to take some PCP, the Paranormal Conspiracy Probe. On your marks, get set, and go!
Okay, and Emily and I have both agreed that we did PCP 40 minutes ago. You guys didn't see it, but we both boofed a bunch of PCP, so right about now it's kicking in. Super hardcore. I could probably fight like 20 cops right now.
All right.
I'm not going to, but just trust me, I totally could. So question number 1, everything else will be 0 to 10. This one is just a really quick question. Are you a cop, Emily? Are you a police officer?
Not to my knowledge.
Because if you are, you need to tell me. It is part of the U.S. Constitution.
Yeah, no, I don't think so.
Okay. I'm also not driving. I'm traveling. So you're not allowed to get me on anything.
And you're not in a car. You're in a vessel or whatever.
I'm traveling. So 0 to 10, Bigfoot. 0 means he doesn't exist. It's a silly idea. 10 means he exists now. He could have existed in the past. And then 5 is like undecided.
10, I mean, at least 10 or maybe more.
Reptilians. From the, I don't know, Draco star system. I guess it doesn't have to be that specific, but like shape-shifting reptilians.
Yeah, I mean, they exist. It's just, I think they exist in a different way than people think they do. So also 10. Like, I think all these things exist, but not how we've been cartoonily programmed to think about them.
All right, celebrity clones. Like, let's say Jamie Foxx.
Same answer. Yes. Yes, but it's not, it's not how people think about it.
Dinosaurs.
This is the one I probably have more questions about. 4.
Dragons. Fire-breathing, flying dragons.
8.
JFK was assassinated by the mob.
2.
JFK Jr.'s plane was planned to go down.
Planned to go down? Yes. Okay, I'd say probably 10.
Like it wasn't just a freak accident.
10.
Prescott Bush dug up Geronimo's skull for the Skull and Bones.
8.
I want to talk really quick. We're going to keep going on this, but I want to talk before I forget about the dinosaurs versus dragons, because this is a interesting pattern that comes up. So lower, and I understand why it is, but I want to hear from you. Why do dinosaurs get a lower score than dragons?
I guess in some ways it's a little bit more of a feeling, but I can't say in my my extra space, my extra dimensional space, like whatever that is, whether it be psychedelic or visionary or imagination or whatever, like there's no dinosaurs. There's never been that. Right. Like I've never so when there's never been that. And so it feels like a construction, like a fusion of a couple of different ideas that like do show up in those spaces. Right. And so whether that would be like an intentional construction to distract, or whether that is just like the people not doing a good job of explaining what they mean or experienced, I don't know. But there's no that's never come up in any of my other spaces that aren't this sort of 3D thing in any way.
0 to 10, Aleister Crowley summoned a real demon.
10.
0 to 10, angels.
100%. Yes, angels exist, but they're not in any way that they're presented at all. Like I do not subscribe to any New Age version, or that there's like the angels that sort of look out for you or anything like that. I think that to the extent angels exist, they either open up a light spectrum or an energy field that allows you to see something differently. They're angles. They're angles of the photon angles of light.
All right, last 0 to 10, because I want to do some more detailed ones. 0 to 10, flat Earth.
All of my answers are like the same. So I don't think it's flat Earth in the way that most flat earthers like insist and want to impose that as the most important thing. I think that it's a characteristic of a much more complex, dynamic sort of system that you can experience it as being flat at times.
All right, I lied. One more 0 to 10. We went to the moon.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did you say 0 to 10 on their flat Earth? So,
Give me a 0 to 10.
I want to say like all of these things on some level
you got to collapse the function.
All right, we'll go 7.
Okay, and then humans have been to the moon. This one feels like you can't metaphorically weasel out of it.
So like, I think humans have had experiences that they have been told equate having been to the moon, but no, like I don't think that it happened in any of the ways that we've explained. Like I think that there's, I don't think anybody went in a rocket to the moon.
Right. So if I make that more specific and say like the Apollo missions brought, U.S. citizens to the moon, then that's a 0 for you.
Yeah, no, I don't think anybody went there in like a craft that moved from one location to another location, like distance wise that way.
Would you, if someone was like, hey, you've got a free ticket and you can go into the moon yourself, you just have to get into this rocket, it's totally safe. What's the chance you'd do that?
Yeah, probably no. Probably no. Probably no, and maybe dependent on the person. Didn't Jeff Bezos take someone to space with his Blue Origin? Like one lucky person won a trip to space on the Blue Origin thing. Wasn't that the
must have
case?
been awkward. That would be a really
Remember
awkward
that?
ride with Jeff Bezos, and he's just like, are you excited? Is this good? Is this good?
Right. Yeah, I don't. It's like one of those hard. Like I'm one of these people that I'm almost a try everything once kind of person, right? Like I say, I usually twice because I have to get my bearings about it then to really sort of analyze it. But I can't. It's just not something I think about. But probably no. I mean, if you said so, if you asked me and you're like, I'll go with you. Right? Maybe I would.
I don't think I would though.
Because that would it would give us an opportunity to have that 4-day marathon podcast we keep saying we're having right now. I don't know, right? Probably no, but yeah, no.
And I guess a parting open-ended question. If you had unlimited resources, let's just, I guess in the most obvious terms, in money and time, right? Like someone just dropped $100 million on Emily and we're like, go and just take your research and crank it up to 11. What would that look like? What would you be doing in a year from now if someone dropped $100 million on your lap and said, go all out?
Probably creating an environment for myself where I can experiment with light and sound. When I go to specific kinds of dance music events that have the highest end lighting and sound, the experiences I have are quite fascinating. So I would be interested to get to do that on a day-to-day basis where I understood what the controls were. I understood what technologies were being used, how much, when, what I ate, slept, did drugs, didn't do drugs, other people there, not other people there, what day of the month, what day of the year, is the moon full, is that right? Really start to experiment with sound and light and creating sort of compartments or chambers of sound and how that affected my experience of my own thoughts and whatnot. I find that I make the most progress in my thinking about things during and after some of these experiences. So it does seem like there is some sort of massaging of the consciousness or the brain, that the cymatics or the lights sort of have. I don't know everything that the person doing the visuals is doing. I don't know who tuned the sound system, why they tuned it that way, what it would sound like if we did this a little different or that a little different. So a scenario where I could experiment on my own body and my own consciousness with a full range of sound, light, chemicals, neurochemicals, all the different factors, time.
How far do you think a VR helmet could get you in that? Because you could simulate all the lights and colors and sounds. The only thing you wouldn't maybe simulate is people being around.
So I think it's different when something is coming from really close than when something is coming from far. So I think that would be part of it. I think I would probably be interested to experiment with it that way as well. But I just noticed that if something is occurring from inside of me or from outside of me or close or far away, and then also there's a certain level of belief as to whether something is really happening or not that affects how you perceive the things perceive the experience, right? So it would be interesting to see if I could replicate in a VR helmet the same kind of experience not in VR helmet and get to the place where there's no perceptible difference between the two. I like that confusion point. Some people would be very disturbed by that. And I understand why. And I'm not saying I'd want to live in that all the time, but could you completely replicate that which you thought was an externally directed experience into something that was completely coming from, not speakers over there and a DJ over there and someone working the lights over there, but literally from just inside the computer that the thing was hooked up to without any of that external stuff, or the removed external stuff. I think it's fascinating. Perception, right? And perspective and angle and depth and all of that kind of stuff. I think that's where the real answers lie, because I think something is completely different when you're observing it than when you're in it, right? Like, I think it's entirely possible that explains the debate over flat or round Earth as well. Like, are you talking about what it feels like when you're on it or in it, or what it looks like when you look back at it? Right? Like, so I think all the experiences are like that. Like, when you watch two people fight, it's much different than when you're in the fight yourself.
Yeah, well, and also like the sensation of you touching like a big rock in front of you, and the sensation of your eyes seeing the rock. Like, to me, those are two completely different things. We consolidate those because that's our reality and our senses are all intertwined, but really they're two completely different things. And we've kind of like combined the two as if it's one thing. But if you were blind from birth, for example, and I guess this gets into a completely different tangent too, but another Descartes, shout out to Descartes. He gives me kickbacks anytime someone buys one of his books. So that's why I bring him up so much. But he also had this. What's that?
Well, isn't Cartesian? So, like, I mean, coordinates were at the basis of everything.
Right, Cartesian coordinates. Yeah.
Yes. Right. And that, I think that,
he's the one that like classified the world into like these little building blocks. But he also had this really fascinating observation when he was trying to explain his logic for why he thought the soul lived in the pineal gland. We won't get into that, but he brings up this analogy of a blind man with a cane, and that a blind man with a cane is poking around and he feels the grass and he can feel the concrete. And what's happening is that he's just feeling the vibration of this inanimate object, a stick, and those vibrations translate into something in the brain that's like, okay, I can feel this. And at a certain point, I'm paraphrasing this analogy, but it's like, what's the difference between a human hand, like that I can go out and I can touch the grass or I can touch the concrete, and just a stick, just a dead stick that you find on the ground and do the exact same thing. You tap on stuff. Because if I take your stick away and you're a blind man, it's almost like if I just chopped your arm off and you weren't a blind man. I mean, one might hurt a little bit more than the other, but all that's happening at the end of the day is that you're just removing that person's ability to like sense in that way. But now you like, was that stick ever part of your body? And if not, was that arm ever part of your body? And I don't know. It blew my mind when I read that concept, because how is just a piece of driftwood that you pick up any different than a human arm, other than it's got little nerve endings that happen to amplify the vibrations? But other than that, what are they doing?
It's like our bodies are like the original haptic suit that are just there to like act as intermediaries between other things and that pineal gland that I think that there's something to that. I mean, there's a book that I knew about for years, but only read last year. That is, most people who are psychonauts in any way have read. It's called The Cosmic Serpent by Jeremy Narby. And he's talking about how everything broadcasts as a subtle broadcast of what it is, right? And it's just the ability of the receiver to perceive it. Do you notice it? Are you aware of it? Right? And so he's talking about it from the shamanistic perspective, in that the reason, like what shamans have been able to do, or people who are tabasqueros or ayahuasqueros or whatever, is they've learned to defocalize their vision to be able to receive the broadcast, as opposed to like the picture that their mind is making, like the full broadcast that explains what something is. And that's how they know what would be good for what. And that's, whatever it is. Right. And then there's sort of like a language that you can use to describe that sort of deeper reception of the broadcast, right? But it seems like almost that's exactly what you're saying, that the grass is broadcasting what it is, right? And if you touch it with your hand or you touch it with the stick, like the pathway that it takes to get all the way to the receiver will be slightly different, but ultimately you're perceiving the same thing. It's just the story you're telling yourself, or the picture you're forming in your mind of what that vibration is or means.
Well, we already solved one basic building block of reality, and that only took an hour and a half. So I think we're on a good start. I think we'll get to the bottom of reality by the end of this 4-day segment. So here's going to be our first break. Maybe make sure you tune back in. This is going for 4 days straight. But for people that are about to tune out and not stick up with us for the rest of the 3 days and 23 and a half hours, Where can people find you again?
You just, I'm on YouTube at Emily Moyer, emilycmoyer.com, and then at Patreon, Locals, Rockfin, all the places. I don't put too much out publicly on YouTube anymore, just because that's just like a not valuable endeavor for me anymore. I did it when I say valuable, I don't mean financially valuable. What I mean is like the amount of stress of wondering whether the thing that I said is going to do the thing that makes the thing happen or whatever it is. So I occasionally put stuff up on YouTube. But there's years of content there, and I still put out a lot of free content and then expansive, very, very deep content for supporters in various ways. But I'm easy to find, and you can always find me here at least for the next 3 days and 23 hours. And and that's all. And I had a nice time. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to chatting with you again soon, my friend.
Yeah, we definitely will. We've got a punch list to go through. So, all right, I'll see you guys, and right after this commercial, we'll continue with the next 3 days.
Dive into a realm where comedy meets cosmic adventure. Chaos Twins, created by comedian Sam Tripoli and comic publisher Paranoid American, will sweep you off your feet. Join two girls with the astonishing ability to morph into animals, rally with their cryptid crew, and traverse diverse dimensions. But you don't have to take my word for it. Sign up now at chaostwins.com. In a place as curious as Crown City, adventure awaits at every turn. Meet Anna and Becca, two spirited souls navigating a world filled with wonders and weirdness. Alongside their trusted allies, Biggie, Mathilda, and the Chupacabros, they'll stand against aliens, reptilians, and mysteries beyond imagination. Dive into their captivating tales and discover a world where anything is possible. For more information, visit chaostwins.com, samtripoli.com, and paranoidamerican.com.